Your slow cooker was on before breakfast. You already knew from the smell of onion and salt pork what supper would be. Nobody knows who stopped making these meals first. Here are 30 forgotten poor man's slow cooker meals that fed entire lives and went silent with the hands that made them. The real test was in the color. She cubed the russet potatoes, not too small or they'd turn to mush, and when the cast iron skillet heated up with a spoonful of bacon grease, she waited. Not for a timer, for a sound. A specific low sizzle that meant the oil was ready and not a second before. You learned it by standing next to her, watching. Clara Canucciari, born in 1915 and raised in Depression-era New York, documented this dish in her viral Great Depression cooking series, calling it the poor man's meal. Cubed potatoes, sliced onion, hot dog coins browned together in one pan for under 15 cents a serving. You watched the hot dog coins split at the edges, heard the small pop when the casing hit the grease. You can make this in a slow cooker now, 6 hours on low, everything softened and unified in the fat. You can find the video online. But the woman who made it for you is not in any video, and the specific sound of her cast iron is not a sound you will hear again. In the early 1930s, in the makeshift camps the newspapers named Hoovervilles, supper sometimes came from a community pot. One hot dog split thin, a can of stewed tomatoes, elbow macaroni, and corn to stretch the whole thing further. Hoover stew, named bitterly for the president many blamed for the crash, documented in the Household Searchlight recipe book in 1931, was the official name for what families quietly made in those Depression kitchens. Government cheese replaced the hot dogs when relief packages arrived. Cabbage stood in for the corn when cans ran out. What stayed constant was the logic. One pot, low heat, whatever you had, enough for everyone. In a slow cooker, the macaroni softens in sweet tomato broth. The hot dogs give the pot a smoky warmth. It started as desperation. It ended as supper. Nobody outside the family knew what to call it. You said Slumgullion because your grandmother said it, and she said it because her mother did. And somewhere in the 1840s, an Irishman coined the word, from slum meaning slime and gullion meaning cesspool, because the stew looked like a wreck and tasted like a revelation. Merriam-Webster recorded the term in 1890 as a meat stew. By the Depression, it had become ground beef, elbow macaroni, and tomato sauce cooked down until the pasta absorbed everything. Your neighbor called it American goulash. The firehouse called it chop suey. In Columbus, Ohio, it was Johnny Marzetti, named after a restaurant owner who popularized the dish in the 1920s. None of those were exactly the same recipe. All of them were the same meal. You browned a pound of beef, added tomatoes and broth, dropped in the dry elbows, turned the slow cooker to low. 8 hours later, the macaroni had absorbed every bit of fat and sweetness, and a cheap pound of beef had stretched to feed 6. During the worst years of the Depression, men riding freight rails kept alive on a stew with one rule: no one eats alone and everyone contributes something. One man had a potato from a church garden. Another had dried beans he'd been carrying for 3 days. A third had trapped a rabbit near the rail yard. Everything went into one pot over an open fire. Food historians trace the name Mulligan to Irish-American working-class communities in the late 19th century, where communal one-pot cooking was the practical answer to tenement poverty. By the 1930s, it had entered Dust Bowl oral history, the dish you made together, using whatever existed, without asking what was in it. In the slow cooker, Mulligan stew becomes almost dignified, beef and chicken together, potatoes, corn, and lima beans, simmering 8 hours into one unified flavor. What those men cooked over fires in vacant lots, a potato here, a bone there, fed a family of 6 for under $2. But years before those rail camp kitchens stretched their ingredients to the limit, something simpler had been feeding America every single day: a pot of navy beans and a leftover ham bone, left alone all day in low, steady heat. The U.S. Senate has served navy bean soup in its cafeteria every day since 1903, when a senator from Minnesota demanded it remain on the menu permanently. She saved every ham bone in a freezer bag. Not deliberately, but because throwing one away was a specific kind of wrong she had been taught since childhood. When the bag held 2 or 3 bones, she knew it was time. 8 hours on low, bones submerged with soaked beans, garlic, and onion. The collagen from the knuckle turned thin water into something that coated your spoon, something the beans alone could never produce. The woman who taught you what to do with a ham bone is gone. A head of cabbage cost 10 cents in 1963, roughly what it had cost for the 30 years before that, and it was the vegetable of last resort, bought when the budget had run down to coins. In the right hands, it became something else. Fatback is the cured, salt-heavy layer from a hog's back, and when it rendered slowly in a heavy pot, it produced a fat that was smoky and porky in a way nothing else replicated. You started with the fatback, letting it crisp until the pieces were golden. Then the cabbage went in rough shredded, the onion in thick half-moons, lid down. 6 hours in the slow cooker. What came out was nothing like raw cabbage. Leaves collapsed into silky sweet folds, onion dissolved into the broth. Fatback bits scattered through like small pieces of concentrated pork. You soaked it up with cornbread. A 10-cent vegetable became the dish people asked for on Sundays, not because there was nothing better available, but because there wasn't. She started them the night before. Always the night before. That rule had been passed down through Appalachian kitchens where dried lima beans were the difference between a full table and an empty one in winter. You soaked them overnight in cold water, and by morning they'd swelled to twice their size. She'd drain them and pack them into the slow cooker with the salt pork. Not bacon, not ham, but salt pork, the cured side meat that was the backbone of Appalachian cooking through the 19th and 20th centuries. 8 hours on low. The salt pork dissolved into the broth, releasing a deep, cured sweetness the beans alone could never produce. The soup was thick, pale, and filling in the way only bean soups are, the kind of full that lasted all day. She made it every winter without measuring a single ingredient. She knew when it was done by the smell from the kitchen and the specific way the steam moved when she lifted the lid. That knowing went with her. No recipe written down since has quite replaced it. The recipe card said it in capital letters, sometimes underlined, "Do not peek." That was the entire technique, printed in church cookbooks across the Midwest from the 1950s through the 70s. Chicken thighs buried under 2 cups of dry rice, a packet of Lipton onion soup mix, introduced by the company in 1952 and immediately adopted by home cooks who understood what dehydrated onion could do, water added to the fill line, lid on, and nothing else for 3 hours. Lifting that lid released the steam that cooked the rice, and if the rice went wrong, there was no fixing it. No peeking wasn't a suggestion. It was a rule backed by the ruined batches that came before it. When the lid finally came off, the rice was fluffy and toasted at the bottom, and the chicken had given everything into the pot. She made this every Wednesday. Not because it was her favorite, but because Wednesday was her meeting night, and this dish required absolutely nothing from her once she pressed the lid down. Easter Sunday ended around 3. By 5, she had already turned to the leftover ham, not the sliced portion, which was tomorrow's sandwiches, but the thick end piece the knife couldn't reach cleanly. She sliced the Yukon Gold potatoes thin, layered them with the ham and onion in the ceramic crock, potato, onion, ham, cream sauce, potato again. The cream sauce was flour, butter, whole milk, dry mustard powder, and black pepper, everything already in the kitchen. 8 hours on low, and by evening the crock had become one unified thing rather than 3 ingredients. Scalloped potatoes with ham was a New England farmhouse tradition before slow cookers existed, built to use every scrap of the holiday pig before it spoiled. Nothing left her Easter table unused. The ham bone went into bean soup the following week. She said, "Waste not, want not," and she didn't say it like a virtue. She said it like a fact. Through the 1950s and 60s, pork neck bones were a butcher's discard, priced at pennies per pound because commercial processors had no use for them. African American and Appalachian cooks had understood something those processors overlooked. Neck bones are loaded with collagen. Simmered in a slow cooker for 8 hours with water, garlic, onion, and root vegetables, that collagen dissolved into the cooking liquid, turning thin water into something thick, glossy, and deeply savory. A gravy built from bones that cost almost nothing. The meat, threaded around the bones, became fall-apart tender and absorbed every bit of flavor from the surrounding broth. You ate it over rice, and the rice soaked up the neckbone gravy, and the combination stopped conversations. What the butcher gave away as worthless, the cook turned into something people drove across town for. Those who knew what to do with neck bones carried a knowledge most of the world had not yet caught up to. And that same knowledge, what a discarded cut could become after a full day in the pot, lived most powerfully in ham hocks, slow-cooked with turnip greens until the pot liquor ran dark as strong tea and the greens had surrendered every bit of bitterness to the cured meat. Ham hocks are the smoked, cured lower leg joints of a pig, bone, cartilage, thin flesh, sold cheap because they needed 8 hours of low, slow heat to become edible. The pot liquor, the dark, mineral-rich liquid left in the crock when the greens were done, was consumed separately, ladled over cornbread or drunk straight from a cup because the old women knew it held everything the greens had released. You never discarded pot liquor. That was not a preference. It was law, passed down without being written. If you had to ask whether you could throw it out, you hadn't grown up in the right kitchen. She never measured a thing she put in that pot. Nobody who made this well ever did. The argument over where it started has been going since before the Civil War and has never been settled. Brunswick County, Virginia claims it. Brunswick, Georgia claims it too. What both versions agree on: an iron pot, a fire outdoors, and a community gathered around the cooking. Original Brunswick stew, documented before the Civil War, used squirrel and rabbit cooked down with fresh corn, butter beans, and tomatoes over a fire that burned most of the day. By the 20th century, squirrel had given way to chicken and pork. The beans came from a can, the tomatoes too. But the dish's logic remained. You made it outdoors. For more people than you could count, the recipe guarded by whoever had tended the pot longest. Church socials across Virginia and Georgia still ladled Brunswick stew from 50-gallon iron kettles into the 1970s. In the slow cooker today, scaled for one person eating alone, it carries the same memory forward. Shredded pork, shredded chicken, corn, butter beans, tomatoes, and Worcestershire, cooked until everything blurs into one smoky, communal thing. Every Monday in New Orleans, going back at least to the 1800s, you put the red beans on before the wash. The beans simmered unattended all day while the laundry was worked, and by evening you had a pot of slow-cooked kidney beans thickened into a creamy gravy, served over long-grain rice with slices of andouille sausage. The dish was so central to New Orleans culture that Louis Armstrong signed his letters, "Red beans and ricely yours," a man from the city's poorest neighborhoods who understood exactly what that pot meant. The andouille is the key, a coarse, heavily smoked Cajun pork sausage whose fat renders into the broth and whose spices bloom through the beans over 8 hours. You never needed to season red beans heavily because the sausage did it for you. In a slow cooker, the Monday tradition works as it always did. Put it on, walk away, come home to something that tastes like the city itself, and like the woman who first made it for you, who has been gone 15 years. The soldiers at Valley Forge ate it in the winter of 1777. George Washington's Continental Army had almost nothing, and what they had was dried split peas and pork bones cooked in iron kettles over open fires until the peas dissolved and the broth thickened into something that could sustain men through brutal cold. Split pea soup has been feeding Americans through hard seasons since before the country had a name. When Lipton introduced a dry split pea soup mix in the 1950s, it simply confirmed what households already knew. This was the soup you made when everything else ran out. She made it from scratch: a bag of green split peas, a ham hock, cold water, and thyme. By hour 6 in the slow cooker, the peas had dissolved entirely, becoming the broth rather than floating in it. The color was not beautiful. Nothing about it was beautiful. But the smell that came from the kitchen on a cold day was the smell of not going hungry, and you have not forgotten it since. If split pea soup was the one every household knew, rivels soup was the one most of the country had let go, except the Pennsylvania Dutch kitchens where it was made exactly as it had been for 200 years. A rivel is a small, irregular flour and egg dumpling made by rubbing coarse flour and a raw egg between your palms over a pot of simmering broth until the mixture breaks into uneven pieces that fall directly into the liquid. No cutting board, no rolling pin, nothing written down. You made rivels by feel, the texture of flour against your skin, the way the egg bound it, the sound of the pieces hitting the hot broth. Pennsylvania Dutch community cookbooks document this technique going back to at least the 19th century, but the knowledge never spread far from the communities that carried it. In a slow cooker, you add the rivels to hot chicken broth in the last 30 minutes and they cook tender. The recipe survives in penciled notes inside old church cookbooks. Whether anyone still makes them by hand is a separate question. It cost almost nothing, and it was the reason Clara Canucciari's family didn't go hungry on days the pantry held only potatoes, 1 onion, and a few eggs. The Depression egg drop soup she demonstrated in her cooking series, adapted from a Chinese technique that immigrants had brought to American cities in the 19th century, starts with browned potato and onion, water added for a simple broth, salt and pepper, eggs dropped in and scrambled through the liquid. No stock, no chicken, no ingredients that cost more than pennies. In a slow cooker, you develop the potato broth over 4 hours on low, then stir in beaten eggs in the last 15 minutes. What comes out is not a restaurant dish. It was never meant to be. It was the dish that proved you didn't need money to have flavor, didn't need a full pantry to put something warm on the table. The Chinese technique, borrowed by necessity, turned a nearly empty kitchen into supper. The reason it was called Shipwreck depends on who you ask. One family story, repeated across vintage recipe comment sections for decades, says the name came from commissary stores during the war years when dented, unlabeled cans sold for 5 cents and you had no idea what was inside until you opened them. The labels had soaked off. You shook the can, guessed, and built your meal from whatever surfaced. Ground beef, potatoes, kidney beans, uncooked rice, and tomato sauce layered in a dish and left alone, or in a slow cooker on low for 7 hours. Shipwreck casserole first appeared in church cookbooks in the 1940s, when the unlabeled can economy was still real and mystery ingredients were not a novelty but a Tuesday. In the slow cooker, the rice absorbs the tomato sauce and potato starch simultaneously, thickening everything into something between stew and casserole. Nobody in your grandmother's kitchen thought it needed a better name. It fed everyone, and the name made everyone laugh, and some days that was the entire point. In the 19th century, turtle soup was a luxury, the domain of fine restaurants and wealthy households. Poor households had the same desire and none of the means, so they built a substitute using calf's head or beef organs cooked in a heavily seasoned brown broth with hard-boiled eggs and sherry designed to approximate the gelatinous richness of the original. Mock turtle soup appears in American cookbooks as early as the 1830s, and by the Depression, it had become a slow-simmer dish made with tough beef cuts, neck meat, shank, offal, braised until the broth turned dark and the meat dissolved into it. Lewis Carroll put a mock turtle character in Alice in Wonderland in 1865, which tells you how widely known the dish already was. In the slow cooker, a beef shank with onion, celery, bay leaves, Worcestershire, and a splash of vinegar produces something close to the original aspiration, a dark, gelatinous soup that costs almost nothing and tastes like considerably more. She rolled them tightly. That was the thing everyone noticed when they tried to make them after she was gone. The rolls came loose during cooking, the filling spreading into the sauce, the shape collapsing into something that tasted right but looked wrong. She had learned from her grandmother, who had learned in a Polish kitchen before the family came to America, and the specific angle of the tuck. None of that was written anywhere. Stuffed cabbage rolls, known as gołąbki in Polish and holubtsi in Ukrainian, Entered American Depression era, cooking through Eastern European immigrant communities in northeastern cities in the 1920s and 30s, where a pound of ground beef wrapped in braised cabbage with rice could stretch to feed 8 people. In the slow cooker, you layer them in tomato sauce and let them go 7 hours on low until the rice swells and the cabbage becomes silk. The rolls will hold if you roll them right. You watched her do it 100 times. You still cannot get them as tight. Oxtail, the actual tail of a beef or ox sectioned into rounds, was what premium butchers dismissed and neighborhood butchers sold for almost nothing through the 1960s. Caribbean cooks, African-American families in the South, and working-class households in the British Isles had long understood that the tail is one of the most collagen-rich cuts on the animal. After 8 hours in a slow cooker with onions, garlic, tomatoes, thyme, and whatever red wine was available, the oxtail becomes dark and architectural. Meat pulled from the bone, collagen thickened into a sauce that coats every surface. By the 1990s, fine restaurants charged $30 for what grandmothers had been making for pennies for decades. The grandmothers said nothing. They had always known, and they had been cooking it since long before the menus caught up. In Pennsylvania German households and across German-American communities throughout the Midwest, eating pork and sauerkraut on New Year's Day was not a tradition you questioned. The pig roots forward. That was the explanation given, meaning the pig's habit of pushing its snout ahead was tied to moving forward into the new year rather than scratching backward like a chicken. The sauerkraut brought money, green things being tied to prosperity in the German tradition. These were the explanations offered to people who asked. The people who didn't ask just knew. You put the pork hocks and the sauerkraut in the slow cooker on New Year's Eve, and by morning the house smelled of the new year, and the meat slid off the bone in long, tender strands, and the year had a proper beginning. German immigrant communities brought this practice to America in the 18th and 19th centuries, and in many households it never stopped. In Horry County, South Carolina, they have been making it since before anyone alive can remember, and they have never agreed on the exact recipe but always on the name, chicken bog, because the rice comes out swampy and thick, absorbing the chicken fat and the sausage fat and sitting low in the bowl like a field after 3 days of rain. You put a whole chicken in the slow cooker with water, onion, garlic, and smoked sausage, traditionally koniku or kielbasa, and cooked it until the chicken fell apart. You shredded the meat, returned it to the pot, added raw long-grain rice, and cooked it again until the rice swelled into the broth. It has been the dish at Horry County's annual Loris Bog-Off since 1979, where families bring their specific version and argue about it all day. Your grandmother's version had a specific amount of black pepper she never measured and a specific type of sausage she drove 40 minutes to buy. Neither of those things is written anywhere, and the dish is never quite right without them. What most people think of as an Irish tradition was actually invented in America, in New York in the late 19th century, when Irish immigrants on the Lower East Side began buying corned beef from Jewish butchers in the neighborhood because it was cheaper than the cured pork they had eaten at home. Traditional Irish food used bacon. The corned beef was a New World substitution born from proximity and necessity, a cultural exchange between two immigrant communities living side by side in the tenements. By the time the 20th century arrived, corned beef and cabbage had been absorbed into Irish-American identity and served every St. Patrick's Day. In the slow cooker, the brisket braises all day in water, pickling spices, garlic, and bay leaves until it pulls apart with a fork. The cabbage and potatoes added in the last 2 hours to soften in the seasoned broth. The result is not what anyone's great-grandmother made in County Cork. It is what she made in Queens. That is its actual history, and it is no less a tradition for being improvised. The bag arrived at church pantries and food bank shelves across the country sometime in the early 1970s, when Hearst Foods introduced their Ham Beans 15 bean soup mix. 15 varieties of dried beans in one bag, enough to feed 8 to 10 people for under $1. For church potluck committees, this was a practical miracle. One bag, a ham hock from the butcher, a pot of water, and 8 hours in the slow cooker produced something that tasted like it had been cooking since Sunday morning. Each variety brings something different. Some dissolve into the broth to thicken it. Some hold their shape. Some absorb the smoky ham flavor more deeply than others. She made this every time the weather turned cold, every time someone had surgery, every time a neighbor was going through something that required a pot left on the porch. The bag is still on grocery store shelves. Nobody has left a pot on your porch in years. But the most honest poor man's slow cooker meal had nothing to do with a grocery store. It started before dawn, in the dark, in the cold, with a man who went out into the woods because the family had run out of affordable meat and the hunting season was still open. Rural families across Appalachia, the upper Midwest, and the South relied on wild deer through the Depression and well into the 1960s. Government relief agencies could not supply game, and the butcher's prices went out of reach for weeks at a time. The venison went into the slow cooker with potatoes, onion, and root vegetables from the cellar. By evening, the toughest cuts had surrendered to the long heat, and the gamey edge had mellowed into something rich and dark. He knew which end of the rifle to point, and she knew what to do with what he brought home, and those two pieces of knowledge together kept the table set through every hard winter. When he could no longer go out, the season simply ended. The soldiers called it something unprintable. At home, where the military version had been adopted by mothers who understood what butter, flour, and a jar of dried salt beef could do in 20 minutes, it was just supper. Cream-chipped beef, dried, heavily salted thin beef rehydrated in a white sauce, originated in Pennsylvania Dutch and Mid-Atlantic kitchens and became a U.S. military standard during both World Wars. At home, it went over egg noodles instead of toast because the noodles stretched the dish further and held the sauce more completely. In a slow cooker, the sauce stayed warm for hours, the dried beef softening gradually, its salt edge fading into something close to tenderness. It was the meal you made on days when there was nothing else, and it tasted like comfort anyway. Pale sauce over soft noodles, the warmth of it, the salt. She made it for you on your sick days. You have not had it since she died. In Minnesota, the Ojibwe people had been harvesting wild rice, manuman, meaning good berry, from the shallow northern lakes for centuries. By the 1950s, wild rice had entered the church women's potluck tradition across the state, most often as the base of a slow-cooked chicken and wild rice soup that became the unofficial dish of every Minnesota church social and bereavement meal. You started with a whole chicken in the slow cooker, covered it in water with onion and celery, and let it go all day. When the meat fell from the bone, you shredded it, returned it to the pot, added the wild rice, and let it swell in the broth for another hour. She brought this soup to every family that lost someone in her church community for 40 years. When she was the one who passed, no one knew whose job it was to bring it. The secret was the onion soup mix, and if you knew that, you knew everything. Chuck roast cut into chunks, the cheapest, toughest stew beef the butcher had. A packet of Lipton onion soup, a can of beef broth, 8 hours on low. Chuck cost 29 cents a pound in the 1950s, and what those 8 hours did to it was a transformation. The connective tissue dissolved entirely, the tough muscle fibers separated into long, soft strands, and the onion soup gave the gravy a depth that would have taken 40 minutes of stovetop work to build from scratch. You served it over egg noodles or mashed potatoes. The gravy soaked into everything it touched. She made this every Sunday through the fall and winter, and the smell of onion soup and beef fat coming from a slow cooker is a smell that belongs entirely to her kitchen, to no other place you have ever been, and to no other time. The rule in New Orleans, where bread pudding has been documented since at least the early 19th century, was that you never used fresh bread. The recipe called for stale loaves, dried out slices, the ends that had been sitting for days. Fresh bread went soggy and collapsed. Stale bread held its structure through the custard soak and the long, slow cooking, releasing its starch gradually until the whole thing became something far removed from its original state. In the slow cooker, the custard sets slowly over 4 hours, and the top develops a thin crust while the interior stays soft and dense. The bread nobody wanted became the dessert people drove to New Orleans to eat. She made it with whatever was going stale, white bread, hot dog buns, dinner rolls, and it was always perfect. They named it pudding chômeur, pudding of the unemployed, and they were not being poetic. The dish was invented in Quebec during the Depression by women working in textile factories, made in canteens to feed workers who could not afford a proper dessert. You pour a simple batter into the slow cooker and then pour a hot brown sugar syrup directly over the raw batter. As the cake cooks, the syrup sinks through the batter and forms a deep caramel layer at the bottom while the cake rises above it. When you invert the dish to serve it, the caramel floods down over the sponge. It is one of the most satisfying desserts in North American culinary history, and it was made by women with almost nothing in factory canteens during the worst economic crisis the continent had seen. Pudding chômeur is still on restaurant menus in Quebec today. The women who invented it out of necessity are long gone. The cake survived and carried no record of the hands that made it first. Cheese water soup might sound pitiful at first, but to families scraping by, it was survival disguised as comfort. When the pantry was empty, the milk long gone, and payday still days away, a spoonful of powdered cheese stirred into boiling water was enough to lift spirits. The steam carried the smell of warmth, even if the meal itself was little more than wishful thinking. Parents whisked it fast so the powder would melt smooth, creating the illusion of a creamy broth. A few shakes of pepper or a torn piece of stale bread on the side turned it into a full supper. Kids didn't question it. They called it cheese soup and slurped it proudly. It was salty, thin, and simple, but it filled the belly and soothed the mind. For adults, it was less about flavor and more about dignity, proof that even when the cupboards were bare, there was still something to feed the family. Cheese water soup wasn't a dish people bragged about making, but everyone who lived through hard times remembered it. It was the taste of perseverance poured into a chipped bowl, reminding everyone that even the humblest meal could feel like home. Baked beans on toast were the sweet and savory treat that 1960s kids loved far more than anyone would expect from something so modest. The beans came from a can, thick and glossy, smelling like brown sugar and slow cooking. Even though they had been made in a factory, mothers heated them in a pot until they bubbled softly, creating a scent that made hungry kids rush into the kitchen. While the beans warmed up, the bread went into the toaster, and that crispy foundation was what made the whole thing feel special. Once the toast popped, mothers would spoon the beans on top until the entire surface was covered, letting the sauce drip over the sides. Kids dug in immediately, often burning their tongues because they were too impatient to wait. The contrast of crunchy toast and soft beans made every bite feel exciting, and the sweetness in the sauce made it taste almost like a dessert pretending to be dinner. It was cheap, quick, and undeniably comforting. Mothers relied on it during tight weeks when money was short and time was even shorter. Kids begged for it not because it was fancy, but because it was dependable, delicious, and somehow always tasted better at night when the whole house felt quiet. It was one of those meals that did not try to impress anyone, and yet it impressed kids every single time. Spam and eggs were the emergency dinner that never felt like one. Spam was the meat that came in a tiny rectangular can, and once you heard that suction sound as it slid out, you knew what was coming. You sliced it thick or thin, fried it in a pan until it crisped at the edges, and served it alongside scrambled eggs that may or may not have come from a powder. It was salty, greasy, and surprisingly good, if you grew up eating it, that is. Some people looked down on Spam, but when money was tight, Spam was a lifesaver. It had a long shelf life, required no refrigeration, and could be stretched across several meals. It showed up in casseroles, sandwiches, and stews, but next to eggs, it felt like breakfast for dinner, which somehow made everything okay. You would douse it in ketchup or hot sauce, whatever you had, and you would eat it at a small table with mismatched chairs and flickering lights and think, this could be worse, and it often was. Zucchini tomato layer. Bake turned overflowing summer gardens into a warm and colorful family meal that fit any budget. Thin slices of zucchini were alternated with canned tomatoes inside a buttered casserole dish, sprinkled lightly with breadcrumbs and a handful of grated cheese. As it baked, the vegetables released their juices, blending with the cheese to create a savory sauce that required no extra effort. This dish became a staple during peak harvest months, when zucchini was plentiful and nearly free from backyard gardens or neighborhood swaps. Home cooks appreciated how easily it adapted to what they had on hand, allowing the addition of fresh herbs or a scattering of leftover rice to make it more filling. Served hot with crusty bread, it offered a complete vegetarian supper that satisfied even the most dedicated meat eaters. The simple preparation, bright flavors, and low cost made it a dependable recipe that graced countless 1960s dinner tables, celebrating the abundance of late summer produce while keeping grocery bills comfortably low for hardworking families. Mock banana pudding was the sort of dish that showed just how inventive Depression-era cooks could be when real ingredients were simply out of reach. Bananas, once imported luxuries, quickly became too expensive for families to buy. To make up for it, people leaned on banana extract, which could be purchased cheaply and used sparingly to add flavor, layered with homemade custard, when eggs and milk could be spared, and stacked between vanilla wafers or leftover bits of stale cake. The pudding felt surprisingly close to the original. Families would chill it in an icebox if they had one, though often it was served warm right from the stove. For children, it was a rare treat that offered the illusion of a fruit dessert, even if no fresh fruit was present. In many homes, mock banana pudding became a stand-in for celebration desserts, stretching scarce supplies into something families could still enjoy together, and for many, it carried the sweetness of hope itself. Butterbean burgers were the quiet champions of the broke man's dinner table, turning pantry scraps into something worth savoring. You'd start with a can of butter beans, mash them until smooth, and mix in breadcrumbs, an egg, and a pinch of salt and pepper. When fried, the patties crisped up perfectly, the edges golden brown and the centers creamy like mashed potatoes. The beans brought a rich, earthy flavor that made you forget there wasn't any meat involved. You could serve them on bread with mustard, stack them like real burgers, or eat them straight from the skillet with a fork. They filled you up fast and cost next to nothing, a miracle in itself. Families loved how far one can could go, and kids didn't mind because they tasted good. It was one of those rare recipes that started from desperation but stayed for its flavor. Butterbean burgers proved that meat wasn't the only thing that made a meal feel whole. They were born from necessity but carried pride, the sound of sizzling oil marking another night conquered. Poverty taught people to adapt, but these burgers taught them to thrive. Potato pancakes made from leftover mashed potatoes were the definition of turning almost nothing into something incredible. Mothers loved this recipe because it let them stretch every scrap and avoid waste, but kids loved it because those little golden patties tasted like a true treat. It started with a bowl of cold mashed potatoes, stiff and slightly lumpy from the night before. Mothers would mix in a little egg, a bit of flour, some onion if they had any left, and seasonings that were often more instinctual than measured. She would shape the mixture into small patties and drop them onto a hot, buttered skillet. The sound alone was enough to pull kids away from whatever they were doing. The edges browned first, creating that crispy ring that every child looked for before taking a bite. The inside stayed soft, creamy, and warm, almost like mashed potatoes in their coziest form. The contrast between the crisp exterior and the tender interior made every bite exciting. Some kids dipped them in ketchup, others ate them plain, but everyone agreed they were one of the best things to ever come out of a leftover bowl. Mothers appreciated that it cost nothing extra, but still felt like a real meal. Kids begged for them because they tasted like comfort made fresh again, like getting something new out of something old. They were the kind of food that made you forget you were eating leftovers because they were even better the second time around. Potato pancakes were a thrifty triumph, a childhood favorite, and a reminder that sometimes the best meals are the ones born out of necessity and a little creativity. Fried rice was the kitchen's answer to, "What can I do with leftovers?" You took yesterday's rice, never fresh, always cold, and tossed it in a hot pan with oil. Add eggs if you had them. Add vegetables if they were not wilted. Add soy sauce and stir until everything sizzled. Sometimes there was meat, bits of chicken, strips of Spam, leftover pork chops cut into tiny pieces. It was not a recipe. It was a response to scarcity. Every ingredient was a compromise that somehow came together as comfort. You learned to make it without measuring, without rules, just instinct and need. But often, it was just rice and hope. Fried rice was the clean-out-the-fridge dish, the we-cannot-waste-anything dish. It was salty, savory, and never tasted the same way twice. But it always worked. It fed a crowd, it reheated well, and it made you feel like a real cook, even if all you did was throw things in a pan. Bologna and apple skillet combined two humble ingredients in a sweet and savory partnership that captured the playful side of 1960s home cooking. Slices of Bologna were quickly browned in a cast iron skillet, then tossed with diced apples and a small knob of butter until the fruit softened and released its natural juices. The salty meat and gently sweet apples created a flavor that felt surprisingly rich despite the low cost. This dish made excellent use of ingredients that were almost always on hand: inexpensive deli meat and seasonal fruit. Families appreciated its speed on busy weeknights, while children were drawn to the fun contrast of tastes and textures. Served over toast or alongside mashed potatoes, it became a complete meal that proved resourceful cooks could create memorable flavors from the simplest pantry staples. Decades later, it remains a reminder of how imaginative combinations could turn everyday items into an unexpected treat without straining a modest household budget or requiring elaborate preparation. Molasses water was one of the simplest Depression-era energy boosters, and it carried a surprising amount of cultural weight. White sugar was often scarce and costly, but molasses was cheaper and packed with minerals like iron, which people desperately needed. Families would stir a spoonful of molasses into a glass of water, creating a sweet, dark drink that was both energizing and inexpensive. Children drank it before heading to school, and workers often relied on it to get through long hours of labor. It tasted strong, sometimes too strong for delicate palates, but its sweetness made it more welcome than plain water. Molasses water was also used as a quick fix when other drinks like milk or coffee were out of reach. For many rural families, it became a symbol of thrift and nourishment, stretching the value of every ingredient. It was not a luxury or even a treat. It was a necessity, one that reminded people of the importance of resourcefulness. In its simplicity, molasses water reflects how people created sustenance out of almost nothing and carried on despite hardship. Boiled onion stew was the meal you made when there was almost nothing left to make a meal from. Just onions, maybe two, maybe one if that was all you had, sliced into ribbons and dropped into boiling water. Salt, if you were lucky. Pepper, if someone had saved a pinch. The pot simmered until the onions went translucent, soft enough to spoon, thin enough to stretch. The broth was pale gold, sweet from the onion's surrender. That was dinner. Served with a hunk of bread, stale and tough, but still sacred. People dipped it, chewed slow, closed their eyes, and tried to imagine something richer. It was not filling. It was not thick, but it was hot, and that counted for something. For families whose stoves had grown quiet, this stew brought back the sound of boiling. It brought back the smell of onions in the air, faint though it was. You could feed 6 with one bulb if you tried hard enough. That was the magic, or the tragedy. Maybe both, but no one ever forgot the taste, because it tasted like resilience, like making something out of nearly nothing. And sometimes, that had to be enough. Cabbage and noodles, Pulaski if your grandma called it that, was a gift from the old country wrapped in poverty. You boiled egg noodles until they were soft, but not mush. You fried cabbage and onions in butter or oil until they collapsed into golden ribbons. Then you tossed it all together and prayed the flavor was enough. It was peasant food, proudly so. Born from resourcefulness, not recipes. Even when money vanished, this meal stayed dependable, like a friend who never left. It was not pretty, and it did not try to be. Just beige on beige with a hint of steam. But it filled the house with the kind of smell that made you feel like someone was taking care of you. Even if that someone was just you, doing your best. The dish had roots in Eastern Europe, but in American kitchens it became something else. An immigrant memory passed down through empty cupboards and tight budgets. You could eat a giant plate for under $1 and still feel like you ate something real. Because you did. Cheese toast under the broiler was the quick, melty after-school snack that could turn even the longest day around. Mothers made it because it took only a slice of bread, a sprinkle of cheese, and a few minutes under the broiler. As soon as the cheese bubbled and browned, the whole house smelled warm and comforting. Kids rushed to the kitchen the moment they heard that little sizzle. The edges of the bread crisped up while the center stayed soft, and the cheese melted into a perfect golden layer that stretched when they pulled it apart. It was simple, cheap, and endlessly satisfying. Mothers appreciated that it filled hungry kids fast without requiring a full meal. Kids begged for it because it felt indulgent, even though it was made from the most basic ingredients. Cheese toast was the kind of small pleasure that defined 1960s afternoons, warm and familiar in all the right ways. Oatmeal patties came from mornings when waste was unthinkable and every leftover had a second act. Cold oatmeal from breakfast would be mixed with an egg, maybe some flour, and fried up like pancakes in a sizzling pan. They crisped on the outside and stayed soft in the middle, smelling faintly of cinnamon or whatever sugar you'd stirred in before. It was the kind of breakfast that made sense in tight times. You already had it, so why not make it better? You could spread a little syrup on top or just eat it plain, standing at the stove with the spatula still in your hand. Kids didn't complain. They thought it was new, not recycled. Families who grew up poor never forgot oatmeal patties because they represented something special, making the most of what was left. Even when money got better, you'd find people still frying them up out of habit. The golden edges, the smell of butter, the sizzle, it was breakfast reborn. Beans and cornbread was the gospel of the broke South. Pinto beans soaked overnight, slow-cooked all day, and served steaming hot with a thick slice of cornbread. This was not just dinner. This was survival seasoned with tradition. The beans were soft and earthy, flavored with salt, onions, or maybe a ham hock if someone blessed you. The cornbread was crumbly and golden, sometimes sweet, sometimes not, depending on what part of the country raised you. It was not just a recipe, it was a ritual passed down from someone who learned to stretch a dime into dignity. Even if it was humble, it still brought people to the table like it was a Sunday feast. You broke off chunks and dipped them into the beans like it was communion. And in some ways, it was. Families gathered around it. Conversations started over it. Empty stomachs were quieted by it. It was a meal you could eat for days without getting tired of it because it tasted like home, like history, like someone cared enough to soak the beans instead of rushing a can. And even if they had to rush it, canned beans and boxed cornbread mix, it still counted. It always did. Jiffy corn muffins with jelly were warm, golden treats that made ordinary mornings feel like something sweeter. Mothers loved how quick the mix was, needing only a splash of milk or water before going into the oven. As they baked, the house filled with a sweet, buttery smell that made kids hover until the timer rang. Split open while still steaming, each muffin melted the grape jelly spread across its soft center. Every bite was sweet, warm, and comforting, the kind of food that felt like a hug. Kids loved their small size and always reached for more than one. Mothers appreciated how affordable they were and how long a batch lasted. Kids begged for them because they tasted like childhood in its simplest, happiest form. They were a small luxury in a decade full of stretched budgets. Pot liquor with cornbread was a Southern tradition that became a Depression-era favorite because it stretched nothing into something filling. Pot liquor was the nutrient-rich broth left over after boiling greens like collards, turnip tops, or mustard greens. Instead of throwing it away, families would crumble cornbread into the liquid and eat it like a soup. It was packed with vitamins and minerals, even if it cost almost nothing to make. For poor families, it was a way to turn scraps into a full meal. It also carried a sense of comfort, with the familiar flavors of the greens and the cornbread blending together into something that felt substantial. Often it was eaten for dinner when nothing else was left in the pantry, but it still provided strength and nourishment. Many remembered it fondly as both survival food and comfort food, proving that even the simplest things could be cherished. Flour paste stew was what happened when flour, water, and hope met in a single pot. a roux of sorts, but made with margarine instead of butter and water instead of broth. Stirred over low heat until it thickened into a pale, gluey base. Salted, maybe peppered, and then extended with whatever scraps remained. Bits of carrot, half a potato, dried onion flakes, or even a spoonful of mustard. It clung to the spoon. It filled the bowl. It didn't look like much, but it had weight. It stayed in the stomach. That was the goal. Children called it paste stew and giggled, but they ate it anyway. It was warm. It was filling. It gave the illusion of plenty. Some added canned meat, others just breadcrumbs. The goal wasn't flavor. It was fuel, and it worked. Flour paste stew was the definition of making do, of thickening up nothing until it felt like something. It may have stuck to the pot and to the ribs, but it also stuck in the memory as one more way people refused to go hungry. Parsley noodle pudding brought a delicate herbal note to the classic baked noodle dish, turning inexpensive staples into a fragrant supper centerpiece. Wide egg noodles were cooked until just tender, then mixed with milk, eggs, a little butter, and a generous handful of freshly chopped parsley before baking to a golden finish. The custard base held everything together while the parsley added color and a bright, garden-fresh taste that lifted the entire dish. This pudding was equally welcome as a vegetarian main course or as a side alongside roasted vegetables. Because the ingredients were inexpensive and easy to keep on hand, it fit perfectly into the thrifty mindset of 1960s households. Home cooks appreciated how it could be assembled in advance and baked just before serving, freeing time for family or guests. Children enjoyed the mild flavor and silky texture, while adults admired its simple elegance. Parsley noodle pudding remains a quiet reminder that with a little imagination, even the most modest pantry can produce a meal worth remembering. Rice and gravy was the meal that whispered, "We made it work," after a long, hungry day. Plain white rice, nothing more than starch and steam, was cooked in big pots that never emptied as fast as you thought. And the gravy? That was magic. You scraped the bottom of the meat pan, mixed the fat and flour, maybe some milk if you were lucky, and stirred until it thickened. There was no meat, not really, just the memory of it. But the gravy carried the flavor like a story passed down from better times. You poured it over the rice and watched it disappear into the grains, turning white into brown, bland into bold. It was hot, heavy, and exactly what you needed. Sometimes there was no salt, sometimes no butter, but always the same bowl, the same spoon, the same quiet hope that tomorrow's meal would be more. Rice and gravy was not flashy, it was not celebrated, but it showed up and it stayed. Peanut butter and banana sandwiches were the sweet, sticky, unbelievably satisfying snacks that kids begged for the moment they walked through the door after school. There was something almost magical about how two basic ingredients could turn into a treat that felt both fun and filling. Mothers loved making them because they required no cooking, no cleanup, and almost no money. Just slice a banana, spread the peanut butter thick enough that the bread stuck to your fingers, and press it all together. The moment you took a bite, the peanut butter glued everything together in that slow, chewy way that made kids talk funny until they swallowed. The bananas added just the right amount of sweetness, almost like having dessert disguised as a sandwich. Some kids liked the bread soft, others liked it lightly toasted so the peanut butter melted a little into all the corners. No matter how it was served, it always tasted like the kind of snack that made bad days better and good days even more exciting. It was also the perfect fuel for running outside to play, riding bikes, or disappearing into the backyard until dinner. Mothers loved that it kept kids full without stretching the grocery budget in any painful way. It was cheap, healthy enough for the time, and comforting in a way that never seemed to get old. These sandwiches tasted like childhood freedom, like being able to run barefoot without a care in the world. And that is exactly why kids begged for them, day after day, like it was the best invention anyone had ever come up with. Hot dog fried rice was the 1980s answer to fast food when nobody could afford the drive-thru. You'd grab the leftover rice from the night before, toss it into a skillet, and chop up a few hot dogs to throw in. The soy sauce packets saved from cheap takeout finally earned their keep, sizzling as they hit the pan. The smell filled every corner of the kitchen, salty and smoky with a little sweetness from the rice. If you had an egg, you'd crack it right in and stir fast, watching it turn the whole thing golden. If you didn't, no one complained. The hot dogs carried enough flavor to make it feel like a real meal. It looked humble, but it tasted like triumph. Families made it at the end of the week when groceries ran low, and somehow it always hit the spot. It stretched scraps into dinner, turned leftovers into pride, and reminded everyone that creativity was just as filling as wealth. Kids didn't know it was poverty food. To them, it was comfort on a plate. Hot dog fried rice was the flavor of resilience, sizzling proof that even struggle could taste good if you knew how to fry it right. Peanut butter and celery rice surprised many families with its simple combination of protein and crunch, while staying true to the spirit of economical cooking. Hot-cooked rice was stirred with a generous spoon of peanut butter until it melted into a creamy coating, then finished with finely diced celery for freshness and texture. The nutty flavor provided satisfying richness without the need for meat, while the celery added a pleasant bite that kept each spoonful lively. Children enjoyed the mild sweetness of the peanuts, and parents appreciated how the dish delivered both carbohydrates and protein at a very low cost. It could be served as a warm side dish or as a light vegetarian main course alongside a crisp salad. This inventive recipe reflected the era's openness to global influences and practical experimentation, proving that even unexpected pairings could become a family favorite. Peanut butter and celery rice stands as a delicious reminder of how 1960s cooks stretched their budgets while creating meals that were nourishing, flavorful, and delightfully different. Mock fish cakes were a thrifty invention for families who longed for seafood but could not afford it during the Depression. Instead of fish, mashed beans or leftover potatoes were seasoned with onions and herbs, then shaped into patties and fried. When browned in a pan, they resembled fish cakes in both texture and appearance, providing the illusion of a more expensive meal. Families often relied on beans because they were cheap, nutritious, and available through relief programs, making them the perfect base for this dish. Some households even added breadcrumbs or stale crackers to stretch the mixture further. While it might not have carried the same flavor as real fish, it was filling and hearty, which mattered most in those years. For many children, mock fish cakes became a familiar supper, remembered later with a mix of humor and nostalgia. They embodied the era's spirit of improvisation, turning simple, humble ingredients into something that felt like a substitute for luxury. Corn cob broth stew asked you to believe in what was already gone. The corn was eaten, of course, but the cobs, stripped, gnawed, and dry, were dropped into a pot and simmered for hours to pull out whatever ghost of flavor they had left. The broth turned golden, sweet, and faintly smoky. Into that went whatever scraps remained: a potato, a handful of beans, a sprig of parsley if someone still had a garden. The cobs were taken out before serving, but the warmth lingered. It tasted like memory, like summer's shadow. Some said it was not real stew, but to the ones who made it, it was. It meant nothing was wasted. It meant supper still came, even when the field was bare. There is something sacred in that kind of belief, in boiling bones and husks and peels, because hope is cheaper than groceries. Corncob broth stew was never about hunger. It was about refusing to believe the cupboard was truly empty. Pancake batter corn dogs were the carnival you made when you couldn't afford the fare. You'd mix up a bowl of pancake batter, slice hot dogs into chunks, and spear them with whatever you could find: forks, chopsticks, or even straws. Then came the best part: dipping each one into the batter and dropping it into hot oil until the outside puffed up and turned golden. The smell alone could make the whole block jealous. Sweet, crispy, and greasy in all the right ways, they were chaos turned delicious. Families made them on Friday nights when they wanted to give the kids something fun without spending anything extra. Sometimes they dipped them in syrup, sometimes in ketchup, sometimes both. There were no rules. You could fry 10 of them for the cost of one real corn dog, and everyone got seconds. They were crunchy on the edges, soft in the middle, and gone in minutes. Pancake batter corn dogs were a reminder that joy didn't need money. It just needed a little imagination and a lot of hot oil. In a world that felt hard, these golden bites brought a little laughter back to the table. Tomato soup with grilled cheese was the rainy day classic that never failed to make kids feel warm from the inside out. The moment a storm cloud rolled in, kids would start hoping their mothers would make this exact combo because nothing else matched the feeling of dipping a buttery sandwich into a bowl of steaming soup. The soup usually came straight from a can, cheap and dependable, mixed with water or milk to make it smoother. As it heated, the rich tomato smell filled the room, promising comfort before you even took the first bite. Meanwhile, the grilled cheese sizzled in a pan, the bread crisping in butter until it turned that perfect shade of golden brown. When the cheese melted completely, stretching in strings when you pulled the sandwich apart, you knew dinner was going to be perfect. Kids could barely wait for the soup to cool down before dipping the sandwich into it, soaking up all that warmth and flavor in one bite. It was simple, cheap, and so easy that mothers could make it even on their most exhausted days. But it never felt tired or ordinary. It felt like kindness in a bowl. It tasted like being taken care of. Kids begged for this meal because it felt like a warm hug, the food equivalent of being wrapped in a blanket while the world outside stayed cold and gray. It was childhood comfort at its absolute best. These kitchens went quiet, and the hands that knew what to do are still. Leave a comment with the one dish you still remember.